Welcome to the Over the Hump Podcast, your gateway to the world of the iconic Brahman breed of cattle. At BRC Ranch, our passion for Brahman cattle runs deep. Join us as we delve into the heart of this extraordinary breed, unveiling its rich history, exploring industry trends, and sharing captivating stories that define the American Brahman. BRC Ranch stands as the pinnacle of Brahman excellence in America, boasting a decade-long legacy of champions and housing the finest Brahman bulls worldwide. It's not just about cattle, it's about a legacy that reverberates across ranches and hearts. Brought to you by BRC Ranch, where the Brahman legacy thrives and stories are woven into the very fabric of ranching. This is Over the Hump. And now your hosts, Brendan Cottrell, Rachel Cottrell, and Keaton Dodd.
Welcome to the Over the Hump podcast. And if you love Brahman history and you love red Brahman cattle, then you are in for a real treat today. I'm your host, Rachel Cottrell, and in just a few seconds, you'll be hearing from Claude Koontz, who's the son of Henry Clay Koontz and a descendant of Captain John Curran, one of the first men to purchase a Brahman from the port of Indianola in 1878. In this episode, you'll hear stories of the famed HK Ranch, you'll learn how the Millionaire got his name, and you'll even hear about Brahman bulls jumping out of an airplane. At just over an hour long, you are in for a super treat today as we go over the hump with Claude Koontz. Hello, Brahman friends. Welcome back to the Over the Hump podcast. Today, I'm your host, Rachel Cottrell, and I am just overjoyed to have with us our guest, Claude Koontz, who is the son of Henry Clay and Mary Sue Koontz. And so what many would describe as, just one of the pioneer families of the Brahman breed. Welcome, Claude.
Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate you inviting me to be on the podcast.
It's so awesome because we actually connected through Facebook, and I can't remember who sent who a request, but I think I sent you a request, and I was really nervous to do it because your family is just like this icon of the breed. And I was like, oh, I'm so scared to send him a friend request.
Oh my goodness. I'm welcome as many friends as I can get.
Yes, I know. And so I feel like we just have a wonderful friendship primarily over Facebook. And I know our listeners are going to love this. So if you don't mind, if you would just start us out with an introduction, a history, family tree. So, our listeners can put the connection of where you fit into the legacy and the saga of HK Ranch, and even, more before that. So
certainly, Rachel, I grew up on the HK Ranch, which is part of the Curran Ranch. That's Keeran. That was established or founded in 1867 by my great-great-grandfather, John N. Curran, who at the time was out in California and had evidently made a lot of money in the gold rush, and he'd sold horses to Brigham Young and made money through that. And he and some partners decided to buy a Texas ranch, and they did it sight unseen. And I guess he was elected or volunteered to be the person to go check it out. And so he took a boat, and I've heard two different versions of this in terms of the route, from California, either all the way around South America, or he went to Panama and just crossed in a stagecoach. There was no Panama Canal then, across the Isthmus of Panama. But either way, took a boat from California one way or the other all the way to New York City, and then from New York took a train to St. Louis. And then from St. Louis, a steamboat down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And then I guess a stagecoach across to what is now Victoria County, which is where Victoria, Texas is located, and toured his new ranch. The reason he didn't come across modern day Arizona and New Mexico, West Texas, of course, is I don't think he would have made it, because that was Apache and Comanche country, and it was sort of a no-go zone. Um, but be that as it may, uh, he decided to buy out his partners once he got to the ranch, and the ranch is bounded kind of naturally by two creeks or rivers, and then on the kind of the eastern side, the Lavaca Bay. The ranch goes down to Lavaca Bay, which of course feeds out into the Gulf of Mexico. And then on the north side of the ranch, I guess they had to get a surveyor, and that was more surveyed out. And then, down the road is some of the Brahman listeners may remember or heard some of the history with Shanghai Pierce. John Curran together imported some of the first Brahman cattle into the United States in 1878 down into the old port of Indianola, which was years later blown away by a hurricane and never really made it back. And I don't think it really exists anymore. But as I understand it, the boat came ultimately from India, and I don't know if it was 3 bulls and a cow or 2 bulls and 2 cows. There weren't a whole lot of animals, obviously, but I think Pierce took the bulls and John Curran took the cows, and they began using those animals on whatever animals they had at the time, whatever cattle they had at the time. And then the guy that I'm named after, Claude Curran, was born in 1862 in California, and I guess moved out with his parents. Took over the ranch when John died in 1901, I believe, and began running the Curran Ranch up until the time of his death in 1931, I think it was. Claude had 3 children: John, Emily, and Armel. And Armel's my grandmother and the mother of my father, Henry Clay. And she was quite a cow woman and very involved in the Brahman business. I believe that she was the first woman to serve as a director of a major cattle organization in the United States, I believe. I may be wrong. And that was the PAZA, the Pan American Zebu Association, which I know is now defunct. But it was around in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up. And I think my dad was a member of it. We used to register some cows in that. And of course, the ABBA had been established in, I guess, 1924. So it kind of hit me that that's now the 100th anniversary here next month of the ABBA. I remember going to the 50th anniversary with Margaret Watkins and Harry Gaydon and all that. I think I was 10 years old. And that was a big time in 1974. And I think Harry was the executive director and Margaret was recording secretary, and of course Sloan and Bubba and all the gang were there. Big festivities, and hopefully, I don't know what the plan is this year. I'm sure they've got a big one, but anyway, I guess I got off track. But the ABBA was obviously a big part of the breed as well. But anyway, Armel established her own gray herd, which my dad grew up in, and it was a part of as I mentioned, the Pan American Zebu Association. And so my father, who was born in 1934, grew up on the ranch, which by that time had been divided 3 ways among Armel, my Aunt Emma, and Uncle John. And so Armel had 3 kids: Diana Massey, who's had the Koontz Ranch with Bob over on the kind of the north side of our ranch, and then his younger sister Emily Dial, of course, had the 3X Ranch with her husband Joe. And so my father and Emily grew up there on the ranch among the cattle, and Dad went off to college and came back in the late 50s, and started taking over his portion of the ranch. I think my grandmother Armel went ahead and just divided the ranch in 2 between Emily and my father in the late 50s, and so they could go ahead and get on with their career in the cattle business. And so my father had a few gray Brahma and some commercial cattle there in the late 50s, early 60s, and then he met really the guy that changed his life professionally, his mentor, Cy Yoakum. And I don't know how they met, but that was really the stroke of what changed my father in the cattle business, because Cy was a red Brahman man, and he was based out of San Saba. I think it's in Cherokee County, and really took my dad under his wing and realized the talent my father had and the huge interest that he had in cattle, in Brahman cattle. and really gave him some good advice and in terms of breeding, and really what helped get my father off on a wonderful start in the business of breeding red Brahman cattle was Mr. Yoakum loaning my father a herd sire, 489, the immortal 489 sire emeritus of the red Brahman breed, which is kind of a base of which a lot of red Brahman cattle derive probably this day. I haven't really kept up, but I mean, he was kind of up on Mount Olympus back in the 70s and 60s when I was a kid in terms of HK, or not HK, it was Mr. Yoakum's bull 489. And the bloodlines were Torgeson, Vernon, there was Vernon, Torgeson, and Cherokee were the main bloodlines that Mr. Yoakum had developed, and that my father really kind of took over. Mr. Yoakum died in the late 60s, early 70s. And my father, by that time, had established a red Brahman herd around a lot of the genetics that Mr. Yoakum had, and around 489's breeding in the early 70s, and was really working on building his herd. And I know he brought in some other, other bloodlines as well from other ranches. I don't off the top of my head recall those, but the main foundational ones, as I said, were Torgeson and Vernon, which is a little interesting side story. Years later, I was working at Frost Bank, and I met a gentleman named Vernon Torgeson. And I said, listen, buddy, I got to talk to you because this is too weird. Our two main bloodlines my father built his herd on are Vernon and Torgeson, and your name's Vernon Torgeson. And he started laughing, and I said, do you happen to know Cy Yoakum? And he said, yeah, I do. I think it was something like his father-in-law, or there was some connection, or his uncle. So anyway, those are Mr. Yoakum's family names, as it turned out. And Vernon unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but I know he had some wonderful stories and some tapes or something he was going to give me, which I need to try and track down. But along about the mid 70s, our herd really improved, and we had a bull that was born in 1973. His private herd number was 42/3. That came out of the Torgeson Vernon bloodlines, and he was HK Vernon 42/3 actually, and went on to our show string and went on to win either reserve grand champion or grand champion bull in the 1976 show season at San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, and was just a phenomenal bull. And as I said, did really well, winning championships that year across the state. And I believe my father sold the fourth semen interest in him for, I want to say 50,000 or 70,000 or something like that for a fourth semen interest. And I don't recall who it was to at the present time, but I know my father being the marketer that he was, really made hay over it. And we took out an ad in the Brahman Journal and took a picture with these people. And, it was a big deal. And we really were, collecting a lot of semen on this bull. We called him the show bull because he was in the stock show, all the shows. And so he was the show bull. And so we did, my dad decided to start developing his own name for bloodlines because we were doing Torgeson and Vernon. And our big show bull was, as I said, HK Vernon, which really went back to Mr. Yoakum's days. And so my father came up with the name America. There was Mr. America if it was a bull, or Miss America if we had a heifer. And so we started naming as we registered animals in the mid 70s to late 70s, HK America, 61/3 or whatever it might be, to start and establish his own bloodlines. And along about the spring of 1979, when he was touring out the calf crop, and he noticed this really large bull calf that was, head and shoulders above the rest, and had a really gentle disposition. Was big, very good on his feet, and marked him to keep an eye on. And then over time, this bull became a bull we wanted to go ahead and put in the show string with LaRue Douglas, who was our custom fitter at the time. And this bull, like the show bull 5 years before him in 1976, really began winning some championships and getting a lot of notice. And he did win the national championship bull 1982. And the year before that, we had Miss America, which was, again, that was the new bloodline my father was establishing. Miss America, 800 over 8, won national grand champion female in 1981 at I guess it was the Houston show.
Mm-hmm.
And so, back to back, we had the champion female, Miss America in 1981, and then this bull, Mr. America, 61 over 9, won in 1982, grand champion in Shreveport. And at some point after that, the McAllisters and my father had a deal, Kyle McAllister out of New Braunfels, to buy a 10th semen interest for $100,000. And my father, again, being the marketer that he was, obviously came up with the name The Millionaire.
Yeah.
But I think everybody can fill that blank in that I was leading up to. But and then he sold another interest to the Somoza family from Nicaragua for $100,000 as well. And he was off to the races because this bull was just stood head and shoulders above the rest. He was perfect on his feet, a solid straight top line. And a lot of animals look good from the side, but when you looked at him from the front, he was thick across the heart girth area, clean underneath, had a very gentle disposition, which is rare for most herd bulls. You can walk up to him, he's a very friendly bull, even when he was a little calf. And his sire was H.K. Torgerson, I believe it was 426 over 4. Which was a beautiful bull and looked a lot like the Millionaire. Didn't have quite his size. It was dark in color and came again from the Torgerson bloodlines of Mr. Yoakum. And the Millionaire's the dam was again Torgerson breeding she went back almost directly to 489, the bull I mentioned that was really our foundational sire in the 1960s. Early 70s for Mr. Yoakum was the Millionaire's dam in terms of her bloodlines. And I was just watching a little video in preparation for this meeting, the promotional video my father made going through the grandfather on the sire side of the Millionaire, the father that I just mentioned, and showing pictures of them. And some of them were out in the pasture, and then the maternal side as well. And then he obviously showed the Millionaire in the pen walking around. But the thing that my father always stressed is each successive generation needs to be better than the prior generation when you're breeding cattle. That's the goal. And he said, look at these. He called them little millionaires and little millionairesses out in the pasture with their mama that he eyed the year before were now on the ground. And you could just see their gentle disposition. You could see how it was easy to pick them out, even if you didn't know anything about cattle, and you sent just a non-cattle person out there and said, go ahead and pick out the largest calves. Well, they're head and shoulders above the calves that are their same age. Their size, their structure, they were, again, solid on their feet with a lot of growthiness, gentle dispositions, solid top lines, and, really exciting. The calf crop, those first 2 years, 1982, 83, 84, even into 85, really good calf crops from the Millionaire. So he wasn't just a national champion that never did much. He was a national champion, but went on to produce progeny that, if my father had lived past 1985, probably would have produced more national champions and more, larger semen interest sales than just a 10th of an interest for 100,000 potentially. It was there. And so that kind of brings you up in kind of a history of the breed from the HK Ranch standpoint, and some of the ancestors and the ranch's history. I grew up out there from the time I was born, out on the HK. It was a lot of fun. Like most people, like you, Rachel, probably I see, and your girls now are growing up in the cattle business, out among the pens and among the cattle, and going to the shows and hanging out in the booth. But we had international visitors because we sold cattle, like I'm sure you all do today, all over the South regions of the globe, to South Africa, to Rhodesia, to all of Central and South America and Australia. and you had all these different people coming to the ranch all the time. And my father was a master at dealing with them because the South Africans would show up and they were no nonsense. And if you wanted to price a bull, or if you wanted to get 10,000 or 20,000 for a bull, you just priced him at that. And they would either decide quickly if they would take him or not, no nonsense. And the Latin Americans love to haggle. And so if you wanted 20,000, you priced him for 35, knowing they're going to want to come and stay and spend the night and go swimming and have a drink and go into town to eat, and then get up in the morning and come out for another tour of the ranch and, talk to Henry and haggle. And so, you come down to 20,000, which is what you really wanted. But the South Africans would come if they said 1 o'clock, they'd be there at 1, and they'd be gone by 3, and they'd make their decisions, and they were very cut and dry. And, as you might know, the Latins would say, we'll be there at 1, and they'd show up at 4.
Right.
And they'd want a cocktail, and we'd have drinks, and then we'd tour the cattle, and Daddy would show them this, that, and the other. And then we'd have the put some away over in this pen, and what's over there? Well, those aren't for sale. And then, of course, the people wanted to see everything not for sale. It's the oldest trick in the book. And he was a master salesman. And so we met all these people, and I met, for example, Colum Graham from Rhodesia was in my wedding, and now I'm godfather. I've been for years godfather for one of his kids. He lives in England now, but it was his father, Angus Graham, actually came, and he spent some time at Hudgens. Colum was doing his tour in 1984, all the ranches, because his father, Angus, was a cattle breeder, red Brahman breeder in Rhodesia, and sent his son, who's a few years older than me, to come kind of do a tour of Texas Brahman ranches. And so he got set up, and he did some time with the Hudgens, and then he was going to come down to the HK for what was supposed to be a couple of days, and he and my dad hit it off, and he stayed for 3 months. And I met him. He's about 6 years older, but we really got to be friends. And then, some other people, my sister ended up through the cattle business again, marrying Fernando Somoza, and who she met through the cattle business and through my father. As I mentioned earlier, the Somozas had bought some interest in the Millionaire, and I went down to Nicaragua with my dad in 1976 to see the Somozas, and it was fascinating because Fernando and Bernabe's uncle was the president at the time. So we stayed at the presidential palace and went to the presidential retreat. We went everywhere with bodyguards. I felt like I was driving around with Joe Biden. I mean, it was guys with machine guns, and it was fascinating for a 12-year-old kid. And so got to be really close with the Somozas. And I mentioned my sister Shell married Fernando in 1980, and they had 2 boys, and that was all through the cattle business. And I went to Australia in 1984 to tour cattle ranches up in Queensland, the McCamies, the Coombs, Jeff McCamey. I'm just trying to think of some of these people. Charlie Hardwick, that guy was a trip. He was trying to tell me the way you judge Brahman cattle, the sole way is, does their tail touch the ground? And
that's kind of an old school thought, but some people still think that today.
Oh, God, I went round and round. And so the Millionaire, I says, I guess the Millionaire's worthless, Charlie, because his tail doesn't touch the ground. And so luckily some of the local cattle guys we were with steered me away before we got into a big old argument, said, oh, Charlie's kind of a old codger and stuck in his ways. But anyway, I had a great time meeting all the Australians. So it was a wonderful time in my life because, as you and your girls and your family probably do with all your business, you meet all these folks from all those countries I just mentioned that are wonderful to meet, and it's different cultures, and then we go see them. And I'm, as I said, I went to South Africa and toured ranches down there with some of the ranchers that, I got to see HK cattle in South Africa, which was so much fun to see that. And I remember when I was in Australia, the cattle were pretty, I don't know who's going to listen to this down the road, but the cattle really weren't near the quality that the South Americans and the South Africans had at the time. And the South Australians were frustrated. And the reason, as I understood it at the time, was it wasn't a lack of knowledge or money. It was health regulations. They had really draconian health regulations that you would ship these wonderful Brahman cattle from these ranches in Texas and America over to Australia to help improve their genetics. and they never make it past Cocos Island, which was some
Mhm.
island on the northwest coast of Australia that was a quarantine station because there was some disease that really just affected the deer in Australia, but it's
Mhm.
possible that cattle carried it. And
Mhm.
so these cattle, I guess, were slaughtered at Cocos Island. I don't know. They didn't make it in. And so I remember touring these ranches thinking these herd, they really need American genetics. And there were some HK cattle that made it in, and maybe Hudgens and other breeders made it through that I saw, but not many. And
Mhm.
maybe that's changed in the 40 years since I was there. It'll be 40 years this summer. But anyway, that was a neat part of the business. And the other part of just being a ranch kid growing up on a ranch was a blast. I was kind of like an only child. My brother and sister were 8 and 10 years older, so they kind of moved on and were off at college or whatever. And so it was just me. So I'd come home from school and go out and find where Dad was out on the ranch, either building fence or hauling hay, working cattle, whatever, and pitch in and hang out and do whatever he was doing. And it was always fun time, and there was always something to do on a ranch. In the winter oiling saddles, or in the winter poisoning, or in the fall poisoning brush. We have a weesatch and rose hedge problem. Maybe other ranches don't have to deal with, but that was always something we did. And it was just a wonderful childhood, growing up out there, because you never knew who was going to show up. And tell you, when cattle buyers showed up, everything stopped, because that's where you're going to make your money. And so if we were pinning cattle or working on a fence, and my mother called and said, "Oh, we've got some South Africans that just out of the blue want to come look at cattle,"
Mhm.
well, everything stopped, and we catered to them and did what we needed to do, and tried to make a sale. And my mother would, if you all know Mother and her crazy personality, would charm them and sing songs on the piano and flirt with them and whatever, and charm them to death. And then Dad would take them out, and the master salesman and breeder would hopefully sell them some cattle, and most of the time did. And we have a lot of great stories that derived from that through the years.
The- Well, that was amazing. I really have no words really to respond to. And I'm such a Brahmin historian. I'm trying not to be choked up right now because the story is so good, and to hear it straight from you and hear the passion, that your mother and your father had. It's just it's so good to hear all of this. So I've been taking notes like crazy. The first thing I was going to say is I know now how to say Quran, right? Because we see it in all the books, but I didn't know how to say it. So it's officially Quran, right?
Coran, think of like
Quran.
Kerr County or Kerrville, Texas. It's like
Oh,
Coran.
okay, got
Yeah,
it.
Coran.
And so when you were talking about John Curran, is this what we were? Is this the Captain Curran we hear
Yes,
about?
it is. It
Okay,
is.
was he a boat captain or what?
Rachel, we don't know, and it drives us nuts. I was talking to some relatives the other day. I was talking to my son, who's done a lot of family history work and stuff, and we don't know. And I wish I'd asked my Aunt Emma. Uh, she was kind of the last surviving of Claude's three kids. Cause that would have been her grandfather. How the captain came about. I don't know if he was a steamboat captain, or
Mhm.
I don't know if he was in the military, or how he got that title.
Yeah.
And I'm still working on that one, so I don't have an answer on it. The captain kind of baffles us.
And so then I loved hearing about Miss Armel Baker because she is really an inspiration to me and many other Brahmin breeders. When I kind of first started studying Brahmin history, she really, uh, her story captured my attention. And so I asked my grandpa about her, and his face lit up and he just started talking about her and how talented she was. And it was so cool because you could see the tremendous respect he had for her, and it just kind of showed me how highly people thought of her as a female Brahmin breeder, especially back in the day where there weren't many. There may not have been any. I mean, she was the first female Brahmin breeder, first woman to serve on a board, and just the respect that she had from other people. It's amazing.
Yeah, she was. I never knew her well. I mean, really at all. She died when I was 3, and
Mhm.
so obviously in 1967. And so I just remember kind of going to an hospital bed because she was real ill. But you're right. She was a pioneering in the breed. I know she did a lot of work, as I mentioned earlier, with the PAZA, and Eligio Garcia was a
Mhm.
big friend of hers. And my dad remembers going down to the Garcia's ranch and seeing Eligio and driving around with his mother, and some great stories that they generated from all those trips. Um, I know I'm sure my dad learned a lot from her growing up there at the ranch, along with Aunt Emily Dial as
Mhm.
well. And as time went by, it was neat that my dad really went into the red Brahman business, and Emily pretty much stayed with gray. So they kind of had
Yeah.
their own niche, and weren't always really directly competing with each other too much. But yeah, it was she was quite the lady in terms of the the Brahman business. There's no doubt.
So in my research, I read that in 1958, the ranch divided between Henry Clay and Emily, and and that in the 1960s is when your dad started focusing on red. And so I think this may be somewhat surprising to people because now everyone thinks of HK and the first thing they think of is red, but originally it was a gray herd that your dad inherited, right?
Yeah, he inherited some old gray cows and bulls, and I don't think it was the best of genetics. And
Hmm.
he was just trying to work with it. And I know we had some commercial cattle as well at the time on the ranch, and it was a lean time. I think they were just trying to, he was a young guy in his mid 20s, and probably unmarried at the time. I think he and my mom got married in 1961. So, trying to figure it all out. And as I mentioned earlier, his real stroke of luck for him, business wise, was meeting Cy Yoakum, who really
Hmm.
was a master breeder in his own right and was a red Brahmin man. And my dad then took to the Reds and really learned lessons. And Mr. Anybody that's a mentor that finds someone that's genuinely interested in their business will share everything with them. And I think Mr. Yoakum did for those years, mainly in the 1960s. And as I mentioned, loaned my dad the 489 bull that was really a foundational herd sire of everything we did early on before some of the other bulls I mentioned came along. And I can remember 489 at one of the front traps. I remember exactly what he looked like. He was kind of light red bull. And he had straight horns, and he did have a perfect back. And I can see where a lot of the herds, the breed, the animals, I should say, derived uh, from my father's way of thinking. My dad was really big on large frame, big cows and big bulls. He liked size and scale, and he would tell you his cattle were always really good on their feet. And when he took pictures, promotional pictures, he wanted them out in the dirt, not in the grass. He wanted you to be able to see them up on their feet, not weak pasterns and kind of back, but up. And they move. He liked animals that could move well on their feet. And that's when I was watching this video. He had the Millionaire and was shooing him around to watch him, trot a little bit, and move on his feet as well with his offspring, some of the calves that had come in those successive years.
Hmm.
Uh, that was a real big and gentleness too. Disposition was huge with my dad. He didn't allow any of the hooting and hollering or hot shots when we're pinning cattle or any of that. We could get two cowboys on horseback pin 100 head of cattle, and they were gentle, and we'd just push them against the fence, and someone would lead them, and someone would get behind them, and we'd push them on into the pens.
Yeah. So I was well, first of all, it just reinforces the importance of a mentor, and how really the American Red Brahmin as it stands today was tremendously impacted, really probably by the 489 bull, like you said, and but then others down the line that's still the ideal kind of the type that is the present Red Brahmin. That wouldn't exist had Mr. Yoakum not seen that spark in your dad and just opened up his program and his expertise to him.
My
And,
dad kind of had, and then the nice thing is my dad was a mentor to some people as well that
mhm.
And we used to have his little advertising group on the back of Brahman journals. If you look at them, 83 and 84, but those were kind of all his mentees, which was like Joe Hudson, Bay City, the Broken Triangle, West Ward, Leroy Janik, um, Chester Huell over in Georgia, uh, to some degree, John Winston, the Winston 8 Ranch. Those were all, some of the cattle that my dad would loan bulls to help out with their herd as well. And we would visit West Ward, was probably one of his very best friends. And, we'd go out to West Place in George West, and we'd work cattle as well, and we'd loan some bulls to West as well. And as I mentioned, Joe Hudson was another one. I think Joe's long out of the business, but Joe was one. Broken Triangle Ranch in Bay City, and Leroy Janik in Yoakum. Was a big fan of Dad's and had used a lot of our cattle and used my father for advice, and probably a whole host of others that I can't think. Dinah Weil, which kind of now has HK Cattle, was one. Kim Dykes was another lady that I don't know where she is now, but out of East Texas. And but anyway, it's a long list, and those are the ones that were really, I guess, that come to mind, or those that I'm sure I'm forgetting people, but he was a good mentor to them.
Oh, yeah. So in the beginning, like back in the 60s, when he got into the Reds, was there interbreeding between the Reds and the gray cattle that he had on his ranch, the existing cattle?
No, I don't think so. I think maybe Mr. Yoakum and others might have loaned him some cattle, red cattle, cows, to put these bulls on, and really kind of helped him out. And then he went and bought some of his own, but I don't think I remember much. I was a little tyke, obviously, in the 60s, but I don't remember much interbreeding. I don't really, Rachel, remember any gray cows. I think by the time I got to be 2 and 3 years old in the mid 60s, there were no gray cows on the ranch, and all I remember is the Reds.
Elevate your herd with the finest Brahman heifers from BRC Ranch. Perhaps you need to replace ranch heifers, or you're sourcing elite show heifers and donor prospects. BRC Ranch understands your passion for Brahmans. We feel the same. Building a strong foundation is essential for long-term success, and we invite you to see our exceptional Brahman heifers in person. Schedule a visit to our ranch by going online to brcatrer.com and selecting a suitable time slot. That's brcatrer.com.
Now, I have seen some old pictures in some ads of HK of some black and white cattle.
Rapucho.
Okay, I was like, tell it. What is that? What
forgot about that. He got those black and white. That's kind of a recessive gene, like the red is a recessive gene, and the black. Yeah, that was. I think he got that from the Garcias, from Stefan Garcia, which is Eligio's son. I may be wrong, but those came from South Texas, and I think it came from some breeders in South Texas that had these new black and white. Not new, but they were just Brahman, but they were black and white. And we had a bull, Rapucho, we called him, and that might have been his bloodline. And he was the gentlest bull as well. We put him on red cows, and he would breed some almost as big as scale calves as the Millionaire was able to sire. Really nice, large scale animals. They were, great disposition, like the sire Rapucho. And I'm sorry, I don't have a private herd number or where Rapucho, it may have derived on maybe an HK bull, but that was, I know the breeding and the black and whites, I think, came from the Eligio Garcia family, and I could be wrong. If not them, somebody in South Texas, a family down there, and their name escapes me. But they were fun, and that was just a little side. They were profitable. The other thing my father was working on when he died in mid '85 was the Brulers. A French breed, Solaire spelled Saler, and Brahman. They were working toward a 5/8, 3/8 cross with 5/8 Solaire, 3/8 red Brahman. And the idea at the time, Rachel, was there was a big swing in diet toward lean beef. It's like, fatty beef's bad for you, and everybody needs to tighten up their diet. Was kind of the the situation at the time, the fad or the trend at the time, and so there was this swing to more leaner beef, and the idea would move toward the broiler. And
Mm-hmm.
my father was president of the Broiler Association when he died
Wow.
in '85, and I think can't think of the guy that took over. Maybe it was Gary Gerhardt. That name seems to ring a bell. Took over, and anyway, I don't think anything became of that.
Mm-hmm.
Really, because the people started eating lean beef, and they're like, "This tastes like venison." There's no fat in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just too lean.
Yeah.
And the pendulum, kind of swung back to reality. Like, I want some fat in my beef, like it
Mm-hmm.
used to be. And I'm not so sure this lean beef works. And I don't care what the doctors say. And so we're kind of seeing that today with beef, and kind of pushback. I'm a director of the Cattle Raisers Association, and we're involved with promoting beef's health aspects, and have all been trained in dealing with naysayers. But
Mm-hmm.
be that as it may, that was a breed he was working on. It was called Broiler. It was a
Mm-hmm.
3/8, 5/8, and I don't think anything became of it over the end of the 1980s. It seemed to fade out, as far as I can tell.
So another thing I noticed in the old pictures is that a lot of y'all's cattle had horns, so they were not
Yeah,
dehorned.
yeah,
Eh,
we didn't dehorn the bulls.
oh, that's right. So Millionaire, yes, he showed with horns.
And I'll tell
Right.
you, I don't agree with dehorning the bulls now. We dehorned our females, and we didn't dehorn the bulls. And why do we need to? Our bulls are gentle. I mentioned
Mhm.
earlier, we have HK cattle had gentle dispositions, and there's no need to dehorn the bulls. And I think it's a mistake now that they're doing in the industry,
Mhm.
is dehorning the bulls. I mean, they look like females. It's
So
like me
we
growing long fingernails and long hair. I'll look like a woman. I think it's ridiculous.
Brandon and I are like huge sticklers for breed character. We are staunch supporters that we have to maintain the breed character. And like every year when we bring our top ones into the barn, Brandon will say, I'm not going to dehorn him. I'm just going to leave him and show him with a horn.
Good for him.
But we just dehorned like yesterday, but he wants to just show a championship bull with horns so bad.
I hope y'all do that. That would be great. I tell you, I see that now everywhere, and it's just everything's Paul. They were Paul Herefords forever, but not Paul Brahmas. And
Hmm.
you're right. We just always dehorned females, and just all bulls kept their horns, is the way my dad did it. And I guess if I he kept doing the Brahman, which is another point I should make. If I had the point I was going to make is, if I had kept, we kept the herd, I was going to keep that same tradition. But just to put a kind of a period on the deal with the Brahmins, as it goes with the HK Ranch, my dad died in '85 in a car wreck, as you know,
Hmm.
and so we're left with a super high end herd of Brahman cattle with a high performance breeding program, and bulls and semen, and cattle buyers all over the world. I mean, my dad was at the top of his game, 50 years
Hmm.
old, the
Hmm.
top of his game. And he says in this video I just watched, I'm looking forward to years of pastures full of little millionaires and millionairesses. Well, of course that didn't happen. And
Hmm.
so we as a family, after we kind of got through the initial shock, had to sit down and say, okay, what are we going to do? Fortunately, Fernando Somoza, my brother-in-law at the time, his family was in the Brahman business. He was at the time, he was in the car business, and had a Porsche Audi dealership in Houston. And we asked him if he could come run our business. So we
Hmm.
figured it out. I was
Hmm.
going to be a senior at the University of Texas. My brothers had started a real estate career, and so forth. And so it's kind of like, who's going to run the ship?
Hmm.
And so fortunately, Fernando agreed to do it. He had been, one of my dad's mentees as well. The Somosas, Bernabe and Fernando had been part of that group that I mentioned earlier. And so he knew how my dad bred cattle, and he had his own little herd as well. So he was the natural choice to kind of be a caretaker. Uh, and until we determined what we wanted to do. And, at some point I had to make a decision, because I did graduate from college in the May of '86. And so it's sort of like, what do you want to do, Claude, with this herd of cattle? And I realized I did not have the expertise. really age 21 or probably the maturity to take that on. I'm
Mhm.
sure there were a lot of people, like your granddad and, my aunt, Emily Dial, a lot of people that would be willing to help, certainly, but
Mhm.
with advice and everything they could. But in reality, it's a lot to take on. And,
Yeah.
especially at the level he was running it. And then to try and follow in his footsteps was another thing I was thinking of that would be pretty mighty big boots to fill. So we
Mhm.
made a decision, as a family to sell the herd, and we actually sold the herd, in 1988, May of '88, to I think the guy's name was Douglas David out of Oregon. But ultimately, we were working with Larry Jansen and Diana Weil, and I think ultimately, I don't know how the business transpired. It wound up with Larry and Donna, and now I think it's HK Cattle with Donna, and I'm long overdue to go up and visit her and see the cattle, and I'd love to do that sometime soon. But that's kind of how, just to finish the story, we got out of the Brahma business. And
Mhm.
I hesitate, I don't want to say, I hesitate to say it because I don't want everybody calling me the day after you do this podcast. But I'm thinking about getting some, red Brahman cattle back on the ranch.
Uh-huh.
So don't everybody call me call me up when Rachel publishes this, because I'm not, it'll be a slow process, but we do have capacity on the ranch now to do that.
Mhm.
Currently, just to bring you up to speed and where we are is, as I mentioned, my dad died in '85, and my mother met a guy named Tom Nelson
Mhm.
in 1988, and they ended up getting married in 1990. And
Mhm.
that was just an ultimate blessing for us as a family, because Tom had a very good agricultural background. He knew cattle, excellent horse breeder, understood agriculture very well, and took over running our ranch. And we were, the ranch was kind of in bad shape at the time, just simply because there was really nobody at the helm. We'd sold the cattle, and uh, I don't think there were really many cattle on the ranch, and it was just sort of rudderless. And
Mhm.
my mother had moved to Colorado, and I was doing other things, and it was just kind of a wreck waiting to happen, probably. And
Mhm.
he took charge and got things sorted out with the oil and gas people who were taking advantage of us, leaving pipes and everything everywhere. We put more farming in.
Mhm.
Got the ranch to drain properly, and really took charge. And for 30 years, ran the ranch like a top. I mean,
Mhm.
beautifully managed. He, in his own right, was a very good breeder of horses,
Mhm.
and developed an HK horses, which were
Mhm.
almost as famous as HK cattle in the end. And you'd see at
Mhm.
NFR every December, HK horses out there with those team ropers, Alan Bach, Trevor Brazil, uh,
Mhm.
trying to think of some of the other guys that people have heard of that bought HK horses. Tyler Magnus, which has the roping show, was a big buyer of HK horses. And so he, in his own right, established HK horses. And
Mhm.
Western Horseman did I think it was in 2010, like a 4-page spread on Tom and HK horses, and his breeding bloodlines, on how he breeds and put together HK horses, and who his mentors were back in Mississippi, and so forth. And we still have those horses on the ranch, and we still have some we've slimmed it down, but I think I still have 3 or 4 mares that we breed that are Tom's bloodlines. And we run an operation now that I don't own the cattle, but I manage them.
Mhm.
Or have Kevin Staples is my general manager. Has been with us 18 years, and so we run cattle on behalf of an outside owner and charge him
Mhm.
per head per month,
Mhm.
which works very well for us. And we take care of the responsibility for taking care of his cattle. And
Mhm.
that's a system Tom set up years ago, and it's been very profitable, uh, re- as profitable can be in a cattle business. As you know,
Mhm.
margins are so
Yeah.
thin. But
Yeah.
uh, Tom's one of the guys that's made pretty good money in the cattle business with this system that he has set up, and I've inherited it, and I continue to run it as well.
Yeah. I I do want to talk a little bit about just a little more, if you don't mind, about the success of the HK program. You mentioned this, but you pointed out that in 1981, HK Miss America 800/8 was the champion female at the international show. And then the next year, 82, the Millionaire was the champion bull. But what you left out, and what I think our viewers may not realize, our listeners may not realize, is that was when all the Brahmins showed together. This was not a red gray split show. This was, all 1,000 Brahmins at Houston show against each other. So the fact that, well, and I'm just going to call it like it is. Some people at that time viewed Reds as maybe not as, quality as some of the grays. And for y'all to prevail, your dad's cattle to prevail with not just the champion female, but also the champion bull, at those shows is just truly remarkable.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rachel. Is the show is obviously since been split. I'm not sure why, and don't need to understand why. Really, I'm not involved, but I always thought a Brahman's a Brahma. Let's see them all compete and let the judge decide who he or she thinks is the top animal. I remember in 1976, the Dials had a bull that was a wonderful bull, Mr. Mucho Mucho out of Mucho Grande was the sire. And Mucho Grande was a bull Emily developed, and then his offspring was they called Mr. Mucho Mucho, and he and the show bull 42/3 went head to head. It was a duopoly in the shows, and they were their bull was gray, ours was red.
Okay.
And, it's brother versus sister, and it got a lot of press, and a lot of fun jokes from all our friends. Everybody's always watching from the sidelines, and one would be champion, one would be reserve, and so that was that's the way I was brought up, and thought that's kind of the way the cookie typically crumbles. But it's obviously y'all it's changed, and that's fine. Life goes on.
So would LaRue Douglas have been the herdsman who showed the Millionaire?
Yes, LaRue Douglas was our herdsman that showed the Millionaire for years, and did just a wonderful job. He and my dad were close. I'm looking at a picture now of LaRue, and the Millionaire outside the McAllister's gates. There's their big fancy ranch in New Braunfels when he sold the 1/10 of an interest. My dad did a photo spread. He's got that trophy, which is now in our ranch office, of the grand champion, national champion ABBA with the three bulls statues on it out there. And so anyway, yes, LaRue was the guy.
And so do you remember who would have been showing Emily's cattle when they had this big competition?
I think LaRue did. They used them both. So we'd always wonder which bull LaRue was going to lead out. We'd want him to lead out. He's the owner. We always wanted LaRue on the halter of our bull, and Emily wanted it on his. And he had his son Gary. Gary Douglas would have to switch off. But, it was always one of the Douglases, but we were always real. Though I love LaRue and his wife Peggy, wonderful people. I was a kid, 12, 13 years old, so I was always hanging out, kind of like you were, Rachel, in the booth, talking to people at our booth that we'd have at the stock show. And so Peggy and then LaRue Douglas had his own booth, and wonderful people.
So the gentleman Roger Watson, was he affiliated with y'all's ranches?
No, Roger was with the Masseys.
Okay.
He was Aunt Diana. He worked for Aunt Diana and Uncle Bob Massey, and I think he lived to be like 110.
I remember him, when I was, just a kid 2 or 3 years old, on the open show circuit. My parents had told me this story that if I ever got into trouble, that I could go to him and he would help me, that like he had saved some child's life pulling him out of pig pen or something.
Yeah, it was one of the Massey kids. I think
I loved that guy.
Marianne is my cousin, and she's the young. She and I grew up together. We're the same age, but she has 5 older siblings, and it's one of my cousins, the Masseys. Over at in the 60s, I think one of my older cousins fell in the pig pen or the trap with the crazy mama cow or whatever, and he saved the life. So he had a job for life at the Koontz ranch.
Yes. So I have another story I got to ask you about. You've got to know your family is just legends of the breed. And so there's all these folklore stories that float around. But at one time, did George Strait work for y'all?
Well, I'll tell you that story. I've got a couple good stories to tell you, and we may go over the time.
We can go. People, I had a friend reach out to me, and he said he wanted to make a rule that every podcast had to be at least 1 hour because they loved it so much.
Well, We may go longer than that.
You're
But
good.
you can always edit all the stuff out you want. There's no
Yeah.
pride of authorship. But yeah, the George Strait story was, and my mother loves telling this, back in the early 70s, Rob Hart, which was one of my dad's acolytes as well, had all these crazy double A cows. And I say double A because they had AA brand on them. And I don't know.
Yes. So for our listeners, those would have been cattle that can trace their lineage directly back from, I guess, the Indian cattle, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
AA, and they were branded AA, and they were wild, and they had horns on them. They didn't dehorn them, but they produced wonderful progeny. In fact, my dad bought that herd in the early 80s from Rob Hart, because then I said, Daddy, what in the hell are you doing? We've got all these gentle cows, and you're bringing these crazy Hart cattle in here that we used to have to help him round up years ago. And he goes, I know what I'm doing. The genetics are wonderful, and our cows will settle them down once we mix them in the herd. But anyway, we went, my dad was over helping Rob work these crazy cows in early 70s, and, trying to give him some tips on how to deal with crazy cows and how to pin them and things like that. And they were some local cowboys from San Marcos area that Rob got to come work. And during one of the breaks in the action, they were going to pin more cattle, and my dad was standing around talking to Rob. This fella came up and said, Hey, Mr. Henry, I am a singer, and I'm trying to get my career going, and I'm wondering if you'd invest in my singing career.
Yeah.
My dad said, hell no. I don't know anything about singing or investing in music. The damn cattle are spending enough of my money on cattle, and I can't be investing in anybody's music career, as he said with his accent. And so, sent the guy on. Well, either later that afternoon or the next day, there was another break in the action, and people were going to pin more cattle, and this same cowboy was standing around, and my dad said, "What's your name?" And he came over and told him his name, and he goes, "Well, listen, let's hear you sing. Maybe I need to diversify my money and invest in a music career, and so let's hear you sing." And he goes, "Well, I can't sing my song without my guitar." And he goes, "Without your guitar? Well, by God, you can't sing, man. If you have to have a guitar, forget it." And just blew him off and moved on. Let's bring on the cattle, put them in the pen. So so years go by, life goes on. And in 1979, 78, something like that, Bobby Shelton, part of the King Ranch family, had a place up in his ranch was up in Mountain Home area. He was having a big party at the Warwick Hotel in Houston for, his daughter or something, big party, and had this band playing. And my parents are always late coming from the ranch, and there's always something my dad has to do at the last minute with the cattle or whatever. So they made a frantic drive to Houston from the ranch to the Warwick Hotel and throw on their tuxedo and evening gown and come walking in the ballroom, and the band had just stopped the song and was getting ready to play. And this lead singer looked up and he said, "Oh my goodness, look who just came in the door, Mr. Henry Clay Koontz. Welcome. And by the way, I can sing."
Oh,
George Strait.
God. Oh my
And that was
God.
George Strait.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Wow.
So that's now my mother tells that story. She says, "Do you all know how rich I'd be if Henry Clay invested in that boy's career in 1972?"
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Do you have any other good stories you just want to share?
Yeah, I do. The one that I always get requested, and it's a true story, is the bulls and the airplane. And I'm surprised you haven't heard this one.
I might have, but I can't wait to hear it.
Well, there was this guy, a cattle buyer, a good friend of mine's dad's from Venezuela, named Emilio Palomar. And he came to look at cattle from Venezuela. And my father took him out, and he wanted to buy some bulls, and went to the bull trap. And, he was showing him the bulls. And he goes, "What price do you price these for, Henry?" And my dad told me, "Oh, my God, Henry, these are Neiman Marcus prices. My God, this is so expensive. This is ridiculous." And my dad said, "Well, hell, this is Neiman Marcus. if you haven't looked around, these are the finest Brahman genetics and disposition that you need to put on your herd in, Venezuela to improve the genetics. He goes, well, I can go down to a man's place in South Texas, a friend of mine who has red Brahman cattle, and buy his for half the price. And my dad said, well, hell, if that's what you're going to do, then that's what you're going to do. But, I'm not coming off much on the price. And so this guy goes down to this man's ranch in South Texas and buys all these bulls. And they get trucked to Houston to the Intercontinental Airport. And they load them up on the plane. And the plane takes off. And about that time down in Port O'Connor, my great uncle, Jim Pickering, who owns a lumber yard, used to, a long time ago, loved to go out on his boat. He called it his yacht, but it was probably just a 25-foot boat, and drink gin and go out in the middle of the bay and get on the radio and hear kind of who's catching what, and talk on the radio and just get bombed out drinking gin on Saturday afternoon. And that was his big thing to do. So he heads out to do that. This plane takes off from Intercontinental. Well, these bulls, as it turns out, there's a reason they're so damn cheap, is they're wild as hell. And, they hadn't been taken care of. They were crazy. They fought. So the fight breaks out on the plane. And if you've ever been in any of those carriers for cattle, the pins are just, like tissue paper. There's not a lot to them.
Right. Because
they have to be light.
Mm-hmm.
And so the bulls start really getting in fight, and the captain of the plane says our weight and balance is really getting screwed up here in the airplane, which is really important from the flight characteristic standpoint. You've got these huge 2,000-pound bulls just going at it, and it's not a little plane, but it's like a 737. So I want you to go back and punch a button and open the door and have some of them get just pushed out, because that's the only way. We're not going to turn around, but maybe the one push the other one out, and you can shut the door, and we'll salvage the few that are left.
Oh my gosh.
And so the co-captain, goes back and, punches a button to open the door, and these bulls about 4 or 5 of them get pushed out and out over the Gulf of Mexico. And they shut the door. Things calm down. The plane continues on its flight path to Maracaibo, Venezuela. Well, meantime, Uncle Jim is out there in his boat, and he looks up and he gets on the marine radio and says, oh my God, I think a stream of bulls are coming from the sky.
Oh my gosh.
And all the people on the radio are saying, that damn Jim Pickering on the radio, he's bombed out of his mind. Listen to him, Brahma bulls. He's drunker than hell. Well, they really were. He witnessed it, and in the distance he could see these red bulls falling, from 20,000 feet. And meanwhile, the plane continues on and lands in Maracaibo, and they let them out at the airport, and the bulls go on a rampage because they're crazy wild Brahma bulls. And they end up tearing up a women's shoe store and a pharmacy and a bookstore. Absolutely, like in a comedy movie. I mean, just go running through it, just tables everywhere, tearing them up. And so the kicker, the punchline is Emilio Palomar comes back the next year to the HK, goes, Anthony, I could have bought all those bulls from you at the price you offered, and then some, for the price I had today to pay to rebuild the women's shoe store and a pharmacy and a bookstore.
Right. Oh my gosh. That is crazy. Oh my gosh.
Isn't that a wild story?
I want to ask, if you don't mind, so this is just a little funny story, but I would like to hear a little bit of the story about your sister, and, falling in love with the Nicaraguan Brahman breeder, because I had always heard this story kind of as a young girl. And then when I was like in high school, I'm going to embarrassingly say I had like a super crush on this international Brahman breeder.
Who was it?
I can't say.
Come on.
I can't say.
Well, I want you to text me when we hang up.
He did not feel the same way, but I kept justifying in my head. I was like, if Shel Somoza did this, I could do this. I could fall in love and move out of, the country. So did they meet through the Brahman breed? Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, they met obviously through my dad, and I'd met Fernando in Nicaragua in '76 when I went down there, and I'd met. I'll never forget, Bernabe came to the ranch in March of '76, and I think I was like in 6th grade, and toured the ranch. They were trading cattle. Bernie was probably in his late 20s, and I remember admiring his watch because it had like a 24-hour dial on it. It was this Rolex watch, and I remember him saying, "You want to wear it?" I said, "Yes, I'd love to wear it. I'm 12 years old." So I wore it for a day or two, and then it was time for him to leave. And I said, "Oh, Bernabe, let me give you your watch back before you leave. Thanks. This is so cool." And I didn't know what a Rolex was, but he goes, "No, you can keep it." And so I kept this Rolex watch and wore it to junior high the next day. I had no idea what I had, but so I thought Bernie was pretty cool. And then I met Fernando that summer when we went to Nicaragua, the experience I mentioned earlier. And then at some point, I think in 1979, he met Shell, my sister. Shell really wasn't big on cattle at all, or going to cattle shows, and just was never her scene. But I think just socially, they met in Houston because Fernando was living there, and somehow, they hooked up through my dad. My dad met them or introduced them, and so they hit it off. Kind of the sad thing with that is that in 1979, the Somosas pretty much had to get out of Nicaragua because there was a revolution by the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega, who led them.
Mm-hmm.
So the Somosas kind of needed to get out or get shot, and so. Shell had never, I don't think to this day has ever been to Nicaragua. And so she kind of heard all these great stories, like from me and my dad and people that got to go down there when the Somosas were owned the country, basically. But she never got to be a part of that. So it was, I was like, "Fernando, you've told Shell all about this stuff?" He goes, "No, why would I want to ruin her life? I don't think you're going to ruin her life."
Yeah.
But they got married, lived in Houston, and he always had an interest in cattle and was a good breeder in his own right, and had his own red herd, and along with the Somosas herd in Hempstead, where they had their ranch in the early 80s. And it was pretty much all of my dad's genetics that they had bought most of their stuff from us, and kind of used my dad to tell them, help them with breeding and what to do. But that's how they met. Had two sons. Lucas is, I think, 42 now, and Storm lives in Houston and is 39.
I love it. It's a wonderful story. Wonderful story.
Yeah.
I have, we're just kind of wrapping up, I have loved just hearing this and getting a feel for your dad's passion and philosophies. And you had said that his goal was, every generation should be better than the one before it. And I just, think of, like you said, him standing out there in the pasture, looking at, the success, and just to think of that. And then to think of, where it is today, the impact that the HK bloodline has had. It's just remarkable. If you would allow me to, I would like to read for our listeners an ad that I found for the HK Ranch, and it was in the 1970s. And I'm going to scan it in and put it like on the website, but it's got a picture of your mom and dad. I know you know the ad. It's a picture of your mom and dad sitting I guess maybe in front of y'all's house or something.
Yep,
with all the banners hanging up behind them, and they're sitting in rocking chairs, and they're holding hands. And the headline says, "Under the HK banner, the Red Brahman has at last taken a dominant position in the show ring." And then it says 28 championships at 7 major shows. And again, this is when, cattle were shown together. And it really just hits me because for anybody who started something from scratch, or who has felt that, fire in their heart to maybe honor their history, but still step out and do something different, like your dad did, with the Reds. There's a poem I want to read for our listeners. And it says, "The American Grays have had their day, but the HK Reds are on their way, winning more awards, as you can see, than all Reds combined in history. Standing above Reds in every class, with qualities that others cannot surpass. The judges compared Reds in every test and rated HKs the very best. As breeders know, the best will shine, and 489 has marked this line. So side by side with championship grays, the purple on the Reds at last did lay." Gosh, I'm like choked up. I'm so
No, that's wonderful, Rachel. I haven't heard that poem in 45 years, so it chokes me up too. I remember them writing that poem, on a
You
piece of
wrote that?
white.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
It,
them working on writing it, and like I said, the master showman, and also loved the touch of humor. And a trip to the ranch at the HK with Daddy was always fun, and you were entertained. But it was by somebody that really knew his stuff. It wasn't just kind of a fun, entertaining guy, but kind of nothing behind the door. I mean, he really knew the bloodlines and he was passionate about it. So it was a good combination of being around a fun, likable guy. And you were going to have a good time and some toddies and drinks and maybe go swimming and sit around and spend the night if you wanted to, and then talk cattle. And he obviously really knew his stuff, and you could talk bloodlines all day long. So it was a good combination. And my mom played a great part in it because, as I said, she has a lot of personality and charm, and all the buyers would come in and say, "How's Mary Sue?" And they were a great team, and that's why it's a great picture that you've mentioned there. Just now about the banners, and actually, if you ever visited our old house, he got all those banners were hung around the ceiling in our family room, and so it was just covered with all those purple ribbons. And my dad called that the negotiation room.
that's awesome.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I'll leave you with a treat here, an audio treat of this. My dad's own words talking about the Millionaire. I haven't queued it up perfectly, but it should work. Okay. And you can edit it, how you want. And let me turn it up. But this might be something that everyone enjoys if I can get it going here. There he is.
Almost 2,500 pounds. He has absolute perfect structure and ease of movement. Excellent pasterns, tremendous muscling. Easy fleshing ability and a fantastic disposition. Notice the strong muzzle, tremendous thickness through the heart girth, and just overall volume of this superior animal. Thickness is something we've been putting into our Brahman cattle, and we've needed, and that's in the front quarter. Some of them look great from the side, but they don't have the tremendous thickness this bull is showing. Well, a bull is only as good as the calf crop he will produce. He can come from the finest background, win all the championships, and if he can't produce the calves, he's useless. Well, the Millionaire has produced, out of about 30 cows we AI'd last year, one of the finest set of calves I have ever seen. As I describe them, we will be mentioning bone and height and length over and over again because they have it. They are the tallest, most correct, heavy boned set of calves I have ever seen. They possibly look a little rough now because they're going to be extremely large and growthy. They have very nice dispositions. Excellent muscling and lots of class. There are two of the little Millionaires right there.
Well, there you go, Rachel. That's just a snippet of his video.
Wow.
Did you get that?
I loved it. Yes. And
good.
For someone, for many of us who have admired your dad and your family for many years, just hearing his voice is remarkable. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad I've come across, as I've moved into running my ranch since Tom died a year and a half ago, and my wife Jessica and I are down there a lot of tapes that, we're always there, but, we're just put back from the Brahma business days. And so this was a promotional video I came across on an old VHS tape that I had transcribed into a flash drive, and then it's easy to now put on my computer and play for people and so forth, and along with a lot of other tapes and stuff.
Yeah. So oh gosh, that was so good. This has been amazing, and we'd like to wrap up every podcast by asking one of our guests who is their favorite Brahman animal of all time. So would you share yours?
I'll give you 3 guesses and 2 don't count, Luann. Who have we talked about the whole time? The Millionaire, of course.
Yes, of course. I think he would be many people's favorite red Brahman or favorite Brahman of all time, because he's just an icon of the breed.
Yeah, he really is, and he's a sweet bull. I mean, the nice thing is he was just gentle, and people could pet him, and he's just a friendly guy. And his offspring, as I said, were the same way. Their disposition, they were gentle. It's amazing the effect he had as well. So that would definitely be the one.
That I words cannot really just thank you enough, because this has just been a gem and a treasure, and I know so many people are going to love it. So Claude, my sincere appreciation for sharing this story. It's been wonderful.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I really appreciate you giving the opportunity to. It's been a lot of fun to hear to recount it, and to hear you recite that poem that I hadn't heard, as I said, in 40 plus years. It makes me laugh, all the funny rhyming and everything like that. But it was fun. It was a great ride, and I want to get, as I mentioned earlier, more around the red Brahman cattle in some form or fashion in the coming years down at my ranch at some point.
We really look forward to seeing you at a Brahman event soon.
You've got a deal.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening to Over the Hump. I know this one's going to be a great episode, and I know hopefully y'all enjoyed it. And thanks again for listening. Hey guys, we hope that you're enjoying the Over the Hump podcast. We've had so many great reviews and great feedback from this podcast, and we've had several people asking how they can support it. So we are proud to announce that we've created the Over the Hump fan club, where you can join and sign up on a yearly basis to help support this podcast and get some really cool merch as well. We have 3 different levels ranging from $40 a year to $250 a year. And at each level, you get some really cool different benefits and different free gifts. For example, at our Trailblazer level, you get a free copy of my really awesome Modern Brahmin coffee table book, which is a 160-page coffee table book featuring the gorgeous photography of Carlos Guizora from Mexico, along with Brahmin history written by me. And then our Supreme Stockman level, which is $250 a year, includes that plus free access to the Brahmin Academy for 1 year. And at our Trailblazer and Supreme Stockman levels, you also get a discount to use in the BRC online store, which you can use for anything that's in the store, including semen, AI certificates, show cattle camp, event registrations, and more. So this is a really great opportunity, especially if you purchase a lot of semen or AI certificates from us. You can join the fan club and get some great discounts to use throughout the whole year. So if you like this podcast and want to help support it, you can sign up for the Over the Hump fan club at shopbrcutrer.com. That's shopbrcutrer.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you are enjoying it.
You've been listening to the Over the Hump podcast. Our passion is Brahman cattle, and it runs deep. And this show is about its rich history, industry trends, and stories that define the American Brahman. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, find us on Instagram and Facebook at BR Koontz. See you next time on the Over the Hump podcast.